Hello and good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all well, and thank you for joining us today on our latest webinar on the subject of GCC oil and gas and petrochemical mega projects in the GCC region. My name is Edward James. I am the head of content and research at MEED, and I will be delivering this presentation today. Now, as ever, the presentation will take approximately half an hour to 40 minutes, after which we'll be doing a Q&A session. If you do have any questions or comments that you wish to make and for me to try and answer once the webinar is finished, then please insert them into the Q&A box, which you'll be able to find on the Zoom bar. So make sure, please, that you ask your questions there, and then I'll get round to answering them at the end of the presentation. Now, just in terms of the presentation itself, it will be recorded. We are recording it, and as ever, it will be made available for you to watch back in your own time, to share with colleagues. And for the actual document itself, the presentation itself, that is going to be sent to you as we speak. In the next few minutes, you should receive an email from us with the PDF version of the presentation. So you'll have a chance again to look at it in your own time and or share with friends and colleagues as well. So don't feel you have to remember or note everything that you see today. You will get an opportunity to look at the presentation in your own time. Okay, so let's kick off. Before we look at the oil and gas mega projects market in the GCC, just a quick note about MEED and MEED Projects. MEED is a news, features and analysis service and platform. You can see that on meed.com. We're covering daily a range of news, analyses, features, commentaries, interviews, and so on the Middle East region. So if you want to keep track of daily developments, please look at meed.com. And then on the other side, we have MEED Projects, which is our online database of all known projects in the Middle East, North Africa, and Africa region. So if you want in-depth project by project breakdowns and be able to use a database for business development and analysis purposes, then MEED Projects is something that you should also look at. And indeed, the majority of the data and information today that you'll see presented comes from both meed.com and MEED Projects. And so you can see the benefit or value of having access to create your own analysis. I'd also like to just take this opportunity before we start the presentation to highlight our marketing solutions business. So MEED can offer a range of different content and commercial marketing solutions to our customers, whether that's in print in terms of reports or other publications, thought leadership papers and so on, whether it's digital solutions, whether it's events, roundtables and forums. We also can give everyone an opportunity to connect with a specific audience. So again, if that's something you're interested in, please check it out and reach out to us. Okay, right. And finally, as with most of our webinars that we carry out, it's being done in coordination with the release of a new report. We have our first ever GCC Oil and Gas Megaprojects report, which is coming out by the end of this month. It is essentially a report similar to the data you find in this presentation today, but a lot more comprehensive, a lot larger, bigger, more detailed on each of the 40+ mega projects in the oil and gas petrochemical sector in the region. And if you wish to find out more, again, get in touch with us. There is a special discounted offer for attendees today if they pre-purchase the report before the end of this month. Okay, so without further ado, let's start with the analysis of the GCC oil and gas and petrochemicals projects market in the region as a whole. So here we can see historically the value of contracts awarded in the 6 GCC states over the last decade between 2013 and 2022. And you can see historically that construction is by far and away the largest single sector in the projects market, with gas and oil in the last decade seeing between $100 and $150 billion worth of contracts awarded. Petrochemicals in the last 10 years or so has been quite small in comparison, about $20 billion. However, when we combine chemical, gas and oil together, we can see that all three of them combined are worth or have seen more than $280 billion of contracts awarded in the last 10 years, making them the second largest segment in the projects market, just ahead of transport, power, water, and industry. Now, when we take that same data for the oil, gas, and petrochemical contracts awarded across, regardless of the size of the project, over the last 10 years, we can see that there's quite a lot of cyclicality around project spending in the market. You can see here that we had a peak in 2014 and 2015 with $40 to $43 billion awarded each of those 2 years. We then saw a sharp decline in 2016, a rise in 2017, and then a sharp fall again in 2018. Some recovery in 2019, an all-time low in 2020, the COVID pandemic year, of course, but then a record high in 2021 of close to $48 billion of contracts awarded. In 2020, so far this year, we're close to $20 billion, which is probably a little bit below average for the last 10 years. We still have a couple of weeks to go, but nonetheless, we don't expect this to change all that much. So compared with previous years, 2022 is fair. It's not as low as 2020, but it's neither is it as approaching or as high as some of the earlier years either. Now, I want to point out this red line here, which is the average annual oil price in that particular year, just to show any correlation between the oil price and oil and gas spending. Now, looking at this line, you can see that it's difficult to make causation or correlation between project spending in a given year and the oil price. Yes, we saw the oil price slump in 2020 and investment in projects also decline, but we saw in 2018, for example, quite an increase in the average oil price, but a reduction in spending in that year. And of course, in 2022, we've seen a very sharp increase from last year to $102 a barrel. But in 2022, the spending is low compared with previous periods in 2014, when spending at the last time this was at the oil price at this level, which was much higher. So I think it's true to say that clearly the oil and gas price helps in terms of project spending overall in the region, but it is by any means the only factor. So when looking at project spending, the oil price isn't necessarily the only thing that dictates spending on new projects. Now let's stay on the historical performance graphs. And as you can see here, when we're looking at oil, gas and petrochemical projects awarded, you can see there's also quite a lot of cyclicality between each country as well. So for example, we can see in 2019 that Saudi Arabia was by far and away the largest single spender on oil and gas projects, while every other market was quite low. On the other hand, in 2021, it was Qatar, which was the clear leader thanks to its LNG program. And then this year, it's pretty much neck and neck between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. On the other hand, in 2018, we saw the UAE being the largest market. So there isn't a very smooth spending curve in terms of contracts being awarded in the region. Some years are good for some countries and some years are not so good. So it's, when you're looking at it from this perspective, then spending can be quite spiky. And that really is because you have fewer projects with higher values, and therefore you do get these peaks and troughs. Now, again, just taking a look at the last decade's worth of contracts awarded by country this time, you can see that Saudi Arabia comprises a large chunk of contracts awarded in the three segments of the market, some $105 billion worth of contracts awarded since 2013, followed by the UAE 56 billion, then Qatar 47 billion, Kuwait at 47 billion as well, although most of that was on its new refinery and clean fuels projects in 2013 and 14, very little since then. Oman 27 billion, and Bahrain, which has quite a small oil and gas sector, just 7 billion. Nonetheless, you can see that in recent years, UAE, Saudi Arabia and Qatar have been the three core markets for new project spending. Same data, but let's look at it from a client and contractor perspective. Here we can see the top 20 contractors, EPC contractors in the GCC by the value of oil, gas and petrochemical projects currently under execution. We can see here that the leading contractor is Saipem by quite a long way. The Italian contractor has some $17 billion plus worth of contracts awarded on execution. We then have TR from Spain, Francis Technip, McDermott from the US, regional company, local firm from Abu Dhabi, NPCC, which is being developed as a national champion for oil and gas by the UAE. Then Chiyoda, Samsung, JGC, Larsen Toubro, rounding out the top 10. Now, what's interesting is that if we were doing this same ranking maybe 5-7 years ago, and it would have been dominated by Korean contractors, but right now we can see only one Korean contractor in the top 10, which is Samsung Engineering. Yes, there are others, Honda E&C, Samsung C&T, Hyundai Engineering and so on, but in terms of the top 10, we now see a much more bent towards European, American contractors, but also we're seeing the return of the re-emergence of Japanese firms JGC and Chiyoda. I expect over the next 5 years, we might see this kind of ranking change again with a lot more Chinese contractors participating. But as you can see at the moment, the market is still quite dominated by international firms, very few regional firms when it comes to a large amount of work in the oil and gas space, with the exception of NPCC. But you can see it's a market that's open to everyone. Not looking at the client side, it's perhaps not a huge amount of surprise who we see here. Saudi Aramco, which would be most people's guess for #1 client, leads the way with $60 billion plus worth of active oil, gas and chemical contracts under execution, followed by Qatar Gas, which of course is the client on the LNG program in Qatar. ADNOC and its operating companies like ADNOC Offshore, ADNOC Onshore, and then some of its subsidiaries like or investments like Barouge, Abu Dhabi Polymers Company, for example. It also has a large amount of work, as you would expect, the three NOCs of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Abu Dhabi. We've got OQ8, which is the Omani-Kuwaiti joint venture developing the Duqm refinery, BAPCO, which is undergoing its modernization process of its Citra refinery, and so on. So you can see it's very much dominated by national oil companies, not many private sector players here, which of course reflects the fact that most operating concessions in the GCC are owned and operated by NOCs, although there are some exceptions, for example, in Abu Dhabi, which does have a lot more international IOC oil company participation. Just a reminder for some of you who have just joined, this presentation is being recorded and that you should receive in your emails as I speak the presentation itself, or a copy of the presentation, and also at the end of this webinar in about 20-30 minutes there will be a Q&A session. If you do have any questions, please put them into the Q&A box at any time and I will try to answer them at the end of this presentation. Okay, now that was the oil and gas and petrochemicals market as a whole, all sizes of projects. Now we're going to look at mega projects in the oil and gas and petrochemical space. Now, it's very important to note but that our definition for mega projects during this presentation and in our report is projects with an individual capex value of more than $1 billion. Now, that can either be one EPC contract on its own, or it could be the program, which is worth more than $1 billion. If there's a program worth more than $1 billion and it has many or multiple contracts under it worth less than $1 billion, then it will still be included. So it's either the individual contract above $1 billion or the overall project's program or field development, for example, which is worth more than $1 billion. Okay, so in terms of what projects fall under that category in the GCC, here is a selected example of some of them. By no means all of them. This is just a selection that can fit in the page today. This gives you a flavor for some of those projects. Now, all told, we estimate there to be more than 40 known oil, gas and petrochemical projects with an individual value of more than $1 billion in the region. And you can see here how they are some of the examples. We have, of course, upstream, downstream and petrochemical projects. We've got onshore and offshore schemes. So, for example, upstream, we have the crude oil GCs 33 to 35 in Kuwait coming up under FEED at the moment with a value of about $2 billion. Staying in the state, we've got the long-awaited Al Zour petrochemical complex, sometimes known as Prize. That's been in shortlisting stage for a long time. We're expecting the tenders hopefully next year, some $10 billion. What else have we got? We've got the Duqm refinery and petrochemical complex. The petrochemical complex will be linked, integrated with the refinery currently under construction in Duqm, some $16 billion. We've got of course, the LNG expansion and production sustainability programs in Qatar, which are both under construction, some $45 billion. With some more big contracts expected next year. We also have in the state the Ras Al Khaimah petrochemical complex, which will be using excess ethane from the North Gas Field expansion project to create petrochemicals through an ethylene cracker. We've got multiple projects in Saudi Arabia, most of which are upstream, such as the Marjan offshore field development, Safaniya, Shedgum, Hawiya, Jafurah, unconventional resources, and so on. And then on the petrochemical side, we've got the Al Miral complex, multiple packages which are under bid evaluation right now, which we should expect contract awards very soon to the EPC contractors. We've also got the Yanbu and the Ras Al Khaimah crude oil to chemicals projects, which are long awaited and fairly innovative in the region, converting oil to petrochemicals, and that's something like $25 billion. So we've got a wide range of mega projects in the oil and gas market. Some of them are already underway, some of them are planned, and nonetheless, they offer an opportunity of more than $350 billion for contractors and suppliers in the market. And it's a very strong pipeline and a very strong opportunity for many companies. Now, in terms of breaking down those mega projects by value and volume, as you can see here, more than $350 billion worth of known mega projects in the GCC. We can see here that Saudi Arabia leads the way with a little over $185 billion, or roughly half of the known pipeline for oil, gas and petrochemical mega projects in the GCC. We then have UAE with about $77 billion, Qatar $69 billion, and then the other three roughly with $40 billion. So while Saudi Arabia has the highest number of projects in terms of value of projects, actually when it comes to number of mega projects, as you can see here, it roughly ties up with Saudi Arabia, some 15 projects in each of those two markets, Qatar 6, Oman 4, Kuwait 4. Now, these aren't individual contracts, they are project programs. Of course, each one of those is going to be split into multiple packages. Now, just in terms of the breakdown of those mega projects, how they're broken down, we can see here that approximately 59% or $220 billion of the oil, gas and petrochemical mega projects in the GCC are onshore, and approximately 41% or $151 billion are offshore. There has been quite a sharp growth in the last 2 decades in offshore projects in the GCC. Until those last 10, 20 years, the focus was almost entirely on onshore projects. This is because it's cheaper and easier to extract oil and gas onshore. But as oil fields age and the demand continues to grow and countries need to increase their oil capacity, oil and gas capacity, output capacities, then they've increasingly had to go explore offshore and exploit opportunities under the seabed. Of course, we have in Saudi Arabia projects like Marjan and Safaniya in Abu Dhabi, which has long been a leader in offshore projects. We've got Upper and Lower Zakum, for example, Helen Gasha in shallow waters. Of course, in Qatar, we've got the North Field, which is offshore. And just recently, we saw that finally Kuwait and Saudi Arabia reached an agreement on the development of the Dora offshore field in the divided zone. So that's another new project to add to the list. So we are seeing that the offshore component of the market is growing in market share and will continue to do so going forward. In terms of the output of these projects, well, of the mega projects, we can see that 22 are focused on the production of oil mainly, 17 on the production of gas, and 7 world-scale petrochemical complexes in the pipeline. This, of course, again, is just mega projects, that is projects above either with a program or individual contracts worth more than $1 billion each. Now, in terms of the active mega projects by client, we can see that in terms of current and future work, again, not surprisingly, Saudi Aramco is the clear leader. It is the world's largest company and, of course, the largest single producer and exporter of oil and gas, with more than $165 billion of known current and future oil, gas and petrochemical mega projects in the region. We've then got Qatar Gas, which is handling the LNG program, raising LNG output from 77 million tons a year to 126 million tons a year for the next few years. This is more than $50 billion. ADNOC Offshore, which handles, as you can imagine from its name, the offshore oil and gas output from Abu Dhabi, more than $40 billion. OQ8, which is attempting to integrate its refinery in Duqm with petrochemical complex. capex out of Kuwait, which has got the Al Zour Petrochemicals project. SATORP, which handles the Jubail refinery, and then various others as well. So what's driving the investment, this more than $350 billion investment in oil, gas and petrochemical mega projects in the GCC? Well, I know there's been a lot of talk recently about renewable energy and climate change and the need to diversify away from oil and gas and hydrogen projects and so on. But the simple fact remains that demand for oil and gas still exists and it's still there, and in some cases it's growing, and it is necessary for the major oil and gas producers, not just in the Middle East, but world over, to continue investing in their production capacities and ensuring supply keeps up with demand. In many cases, this is now changing to ensuring that supply is maintained from existing fields as they age. However, there's still a very strong need for hydrocarbons. And if you can see here from 4 of the main oil and gas producers in the GCC, that all of them have some very ambitious or some quite substantial increases in oil or gas output. For example, the UAE, from 4 million barrels a day approximately, it wants to raise production capacity to 5 million barrels a day in the next 3 years. Through spending something like $150 billion. Saudi Arabia wants to increase output capacity by another 1 million barrels a day by 2027, and Aramco is estimated to spend between $40 and $50 billion a year on projects. Kuwait wants to more than double its output capacity to 4.7 million barrels a day by 2040, and says that it plans to spend $44 billion on oil and gas projects by 2025. And in Qatar, the emphasis is obviously much more on gas output, particularly LNG. And as I mentioned earlier, it is one of the world's largest exporters of LNG, with a current capacity in Mesaieed and Ras Laffan of some 77 million tons a year. It wants to increase that to 126 million tons a year by 2030. Now, the first stage of that, bringing LNG output to 110 million tons a year, is now under construction under 3 huge EPC contracts awarded early last year. And it's currently, there's bidding is underway for bringing that total up from 110 to 126 million tons a year, which we should see awarded next year. And it says it plans to spend $83 billion by 2025. Now, just be aware that these sums most likely include already committed and spent expenditure, and also may not necessarily always incorporate just capex. There may be a lot of OPEX in that. There may be other costs as well, consulting, addition to operational procurement, and so on. So not necessarily all these numbers are going into new projects, but nonetheless, it is indicative of a very sharp increase in project spending. The other thing to bear in mind as well is that with oil averaging about 102 barrels this year and currently about $80 a barrel, and of course gas prices at record highs earlier this year, this also means that revenues are extremely high for each of these markets, and therefore the governments have more money to spend on projects, which of course gives them more confidence. We have more confidence that these projects will proceed. We're going to see quite a lot of GDP growth this year. We are going to see quite some substantial budget surpluses after a few difficult years, and we expect that much of this will be re-injected back into oil and gas spending. Now, all told, what are the major drivers for oil and gas market? Well, as we just discussed, higher oil prices allow for greater spending, but we also still have the long-term need to maintain and increase oil output to meet rising global demand. Even when global demand for hydrogen begins to drop, which for hydrocarbons begins to drop, which will inevitably be over the next 5 to 10 years, it's worth bearing in mind that the GCC producers have the world's lowest cost of production. So they will still be able to maintain a very large market share, and indeed will be the last standing producers of oil and gas in the next 2 or 3 generations. Another major investment driver is the fact that reservoirs are aging in the region after many years of production, some of them going back 50, 60, 70 years. And therefore, as they reach the end of their lifetimes or the pressure drops in them, it's necessary to apply for the first time some enhanced oil recovery techniques. And so when we start seeing Aramco, for example, investing in unconventional resources or shale gas or water injection and so forth, it really is about maintaining output from some of these aging fields as well. Clearly, the Ukraine-Russia crisis has resulted in very high gas prices this year, but it's also made it clear that European countries in particular need to diversify and find new sources of gas. This has prompted, in part, the expansion of gas export investment in Qatar, for example, but also it will be a case also in the other GCC states. So that's another major driver. We're also seeing increased foreign investment in the oil and gas markets, a number of JV agreements signed, particularly in upstream Abu Dhabi, but also downstream in petrochemical projects in places like Qatar and Saudi Arabia, seeking investment and international markets as well. So that is another significant cause of investment. As I already touched on this as well, there's new investment going into shale gas and unconventional resources, which previously would have been quite expensive to invest in, but which are now something with the oil price, particularly above $100 a barrel on average this year, make more and more commercial sense. And then finally, something we've been seeing over the last 5-10 years is the integration of existing downstream assets, refinery assets, with new petrochemical complexes. Petrochemicals is seen as a means of creating jobs, but also diversifying economies and going down the value chain. So that is something which is also a major driver of mega project activity. Now, just to go into a few of the examples of some of these mega projects here today. We've got the first one we're going to just illustrate today, which is the Marjan Field Development Project, which was awarded a couple of years ago. Massive project, worth more than $20 billion and comprising more than 30 main EPC packages. So this is an integrated oil, gas, non-associated gas project offshore and involves essentially the production of new oil and gas reserves and then the transport of them onshore for treatment and then also the export of water for re-injection into the fields as a very basic summary of the project. Now, Marjan dates back to late 1960s with first production in 1973. Then they embarked on a second phase a few years ago to bring increased output, as you can see here, by 300,000 barrels a day and some 2.5 billion cubic feet a day of gas, and also to produce some ethane for petrochemical use. And as you can see here, also from the project description, it's going to produce propane and butane for export, possibly to other petrochemical producers in the kingdom as well. So it's a very diverse, large project, and with multiple companies and stakeholders. Now, as we move into 2023, there is a third phase of investment offshore at four new well drilling packages, which I'll go through in a minute. And this is essentially used to maintain output, which will be on the third phase of this project. Now, as you can see here, the first phase of Marjan was completed in 1973. This was the original field development. And then phase 2, which was awarded in 2019, comprises of multiple major packages. As you can see, water injection onshore, you can see water injection onshore facilities and so forth, gas treatment and sulfur recovery. I won't go for each one. And then, of course, multiple offshore packages as well, tie-in platforms, gas oil separation plants, a cogeneration facility, various substations, roads, accommodation packages, and so on. And then coming up next year, we have a further expansion, phase 3, which is offshore, known by the CRPO numerical classification system by Aramco, 117, 118, 119, and 8 jacket installations as well. Bidding is underway for those, and we'll see those hopefully awarded next year to the long-term, under the long-term agreement program. So well underway now, huge amount of investment, and currently ongoing. So here's just a quick summary of what I just described from the Marjan program. And then here we have, again, I won't go through all of this, but here we have some of the more granular details on the individual packages. Who is the FEED and PMC consultants? Who are the bidding contractors, and completion dates, and of course the actual contractors who won the contracts, as well as the scopes for the individual packages themselves. And there's more. Massive project, as you can see, many multiple packages. You can see here a wide variety of different contractors. Saipem won a lot, some local firms like Al-Kifar, Rashid and Trading Contracting, Nesman Partners. We've got Chinese Sinopec, some Koreans, Samsung C&T, and so on. And then in terms of the phase 3 expansion, as you can see here, we have bids underway for some of the production deck modules and pipelines, with some scope here, and from the LTA contractor pool of companies, and we expect those to be awarded next year. And that really is just to maintain output at the field. Now, just in case there are some of you here who aren't already pre-qualified with Aramco or haven't before worked with them, Aramco has a vendor registration process, with the details of which you can find in quite good detail on its website, and depending on what you sell or the services you offer, you can partner with Aramco, be registered with them to be invited to bid for projects or services within your scope. Now, important thing to bear in mind with Saudi Arabia is the ICTVA program, the In-Kingdom Total Value Add, which essentially is a mandate or requirement for companies to ensure that they source locally, have local content, local labor and engineering, and that the money that Aramco spends is kept in Kingdom rather than simply being exported out of it. And you can see from this page that Aramco has made quite good strides here. In 2021, 59% of spend was localized, which was at a local level. So certainly for companies who wish to work with Aramco on some of these big mega projects, this is certainly something that will have to be considered. It will be used in the technical evaluation and commercial evaluation of projects and contracts. And again, if you want to know more about the ICTVA process, how to obtain your certificate of to be part of the ICTVA program, then you can find out more from ictva.sa. Right, next project we'll look at is the Ta'aziz petrochemical derivative complex in Ruwais in the west of Abu Dhabi. Now, this is a petrochemical complex coming up, which is aimed at creating a diversified or derivative chemicals production complex alongside downstream refining facilities in Ruwais. Ta'aziz itself is a JV between ADQ and ADNOC, and it's really about maximizing Abu Dhabi's oil and gas value chain rather than simply exporting oil and gas. The idea is essentially to use that oil and gas and to maximize its value by producing chemicals alongside the refining facilities and then exporting those chemicals, thereby creating jobs and diversifying the economy further away from oil and gas. Now, TA'ZIZ is the central complex utilizing shared utilities and facilities such as seawater intake, desalination, waste treatment, and so forth, roads and export facilities and infrastructure. But within that complex, there will be multiple different plants. You can see those anchor projects here: chlor-alkali facility, the EDC, plant elastomers, maleic anhydride, methanol, ammonia, isopropyl alcohol, and so on, as well as a steam cogeneration plant as well called Project Volta. Now, TA'ZIZ is going to be implementing these projects with foreign partners. India, Reliance of India and Shaheen Chem Holdings have already signed a couple of JVs with TA'ZIZ for the chlor-alkali, EDC and elastomers plants, and they will be the JV partners. Likewise, for methanol, there's Proman from Switzerland has also signed an agreement. And for the ammonia, which I believe is going to be green ammonia, there's Fertiglobe, which is a JV of ADNOC and OCI, as well as Mitsui and GS have signed an agreement for that. The power cogeneration plant will be implemented on a PPP basis, with ADNOC supplying, TA'ZIZ supplying the feedstock, and there being a power purchase agreement, which will be take or pay for the power produced. And as you can see here, a couple of plants have no yet announced JV partners, and I'm sure TA'ZIZ is negotiating them, I'm sure, at this moment in time. Total investment value is about $5 billion, could well be more than that, depending on the ultimate output. And as you can see here, the derivatives complex, TA'ZIZ derivatives complex, is intricately linked or integrated with other downstream facilities. In Ruwais, you can see here the Borouge 4 petrochemical complex, which is currently under construction. The sulfur handling terminal, we've got the fertilizer plant, we have the existing refinery complex, we have also housing facilities and so on, and the planned new refinery. So the idea is that you will take, companies can take the offtake from a lot of the output from these facilities and use them as feedstock for their own production of derived chemicals, and then derivative chemicals, and then use the existing facilities for seawater intake or cooling purposes, electricity and so forth, and then marine export facilities for the export of their products. It's all about maintaining in-country value chain and maximizing the value out of the country's natural resources. Just in terms of a very basic project breakdown, as you can see here, we've got the first phase. We have what we call the industrial chemical zones with the main anchor projects. We then have a light industrial zone with various different light industries, taking some of the output and converting them into final end products. And then we have this sort of joint industrial services zone where we have the cogeneration facility, the export facilities, and of course, some existing facilities for shared use. Later on down the line, there will be a phase 2 for investment in additional products and derivative chemicals that will come in over the next 5 years or so. So pre-feed is well underway on TA'ZIZ, and we're obviously waiting for some further joint venture agreements to be announced. But with several of the plants, there already is a JV agreement, and we would expect the EPC contracts for a lot of them to be awarded over the next year, 18 months or so. So plenty of work is going to be happening there in Ruwais, which is already a very busy area, of Borouge 4 under construction, potentially new refinery as well for ADNOC and Ruwais, and it's going to be at the center of the world petrochemicals industry over time. Just again here, a bit more breakdown of the capacities for each project, some of the bidders ongoing for them, the status of the projects and so on. And just to give you an idea of some of the forthcoming EPC contracts which will be tendered and awarded. Of course, with them comes a lot of supply and subcontracting opportunities. Lastly, I just want to go through today the Al Zour petrochemical complex in Kuwait. This has been a long-awaited olefins propylene production unit, which is integrated with the Al Zour refinery. It is going to have its well-scale project with 940,000 tons a year, probably propylene, 1.4 million tons a year paraxylene, and so on. It has gone through various studies and FEED, looking at the market feasibility for it. Last market feasibility study was completed just last month by Wood Mackenzie. Wood is doing the FEED. Pre-qualification for the 3 main packages was completed in March or April 2021, and we are now just waiting for the EPC contractors to come out. The contracts to come out. Here we have the basic units. We have package 1, which is the gasoline unit, package 2 covering aromatics and olefins, and package 3 covering export facilities. So we are excited about that project, which with any luck will be tendered next year. Although since we've been waiting for this project a long time, we'll wait and see how that pans out. Anyway, as I said, there are, as you can see here, there are more than 40 major oil, gas and petrochemical mega projects, each with a total value of more than $1 billion, either as individual contracts or as programs in the region. Here's a selection of them. And obviously don't have time to get today to go through them all, but this hopefully gives you an idea of the size of the market and some of the future opportunities that are available. As I mentioned, if you want to get details of every single of those projects in the kind of depth that we've just saw with the Marjan description of the project we just saw, then please take a look at our GCC Oil and Gas Megaprojects 2023 report. If you're interested, there is actually a discount of $500 for anyone who buys it before the end of this month. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation. I'll now take questions from the attendees. I can see I've already got more than 25 questions, and I will attempt to answer them now. Okay, so let me see. The first question I've got is, do we have a list of projects coming into Yanbu Industrial City in Saudi Arabia? So the one big project I think we got good visibility on in Yanbu is the crude oil to chemicals project, long planned between SABIC and Aramco. That's some $25 billion. That's been in the planning stage for quite a long time, and we should see, with any luck, that coming to fruition over the next 18 months or so. There is another similar project now planned in Ras Al Khair, but this Yanbu one has been in the pipeline for a long time now, so that I think will dominate the oil and gas space there. Obviously, there's not much oil and gas production in Yanbu, being on the Red Sea coast, so it's mainly downstream focus. The other project that we can see potentially in Yanbu is the expansion of the Yasref refinery. Now, as you may all have seen, last week President Xi of China visited Saudi Arabia, and there is hope that the existing Yanbu refinery, which is a JV between Aramco and Sinopec, would have been announced, or second phase expansion would have been announced during President Xi's visit. We don't see anything officially that was announced there, but we are hopeful that something will be announced over the next few weeks and months that will see that being expanded. Otherwise, in terms of the mega projects, that's really going to dominate the pipeline. Smaller projects, of course, there's always going to be lots of smaller projects, but in terms of mega projects, that's really it. Is there a reason for not including Hail and Ghasha in the UAE? No, there is no reason for not including Hail and Ghasha. Hail and Ghasha is, of course, a major mega project. It's something that everyone talks about all of the time, and it's something that everyone is excited about. It's a huge project, of course, has reached tender stage before, only to have been postponed at the last minute, but we are expecting it to be awarded over the next year, and that really is going to be the largest upstream oil and gas investment for a long time in Abu Dhabi and ADNOC and UAE in general. So I didn't have a chance to go through all of the mega projects today, but that is clearly one of the major ones. And of course, that list that I showed earlier here is only some of the mega projects in the region. Okay, next question. So question, what if oil and gas prices fall? What would be the impact on oil and gas spending? Well, I think as we saw earlier in the correlation graph right at the beginning of my presentation here, you can see that actually there's a bit of a disconnect between oil and gas spending on projects and the actual oil and gas price. And that really is because when NOCs are looking at investment in projects, they're looking at the situation or picture in 5 years' time, 3 to 5 years' time, when their projects actually come online and have an impact. So they're not necessarily always looking at the prices today. They also need to take into account higher EPC prices, such as cost inflation, and decide when is the best time and best value for money to launch or award their projects, which is also another very key factor. So even if projects, even if oil and gas prices were to decline, if there was if the NOC saw a long-term requirement for increased output or for chemicals production, then they would for sure they for sure will. Let me just share this screen again. If you don't, they will for sure invest in those projects. Okay. Next questions. Okay, can you please share the current and target capacity for Oman and Bahrain? I didn't include Oman and Bahrain in the targets simply because they don't really have very specific increases planned or announced, and that's because they're already working at quite a lot of capacity, and therefore do not have a lot more to be able to add. Now, that of course doesn't mean that in the areas of hydrogen, in particular, in Oman and also downstream in Bahrain and also offshore, but it means that there isn't a huge amount of extra capacity coming on stream there. So we're just fixing the screen so you can see the presentation again. There we are. Okay. Thank you, Nabil. Always, when doing something live, there's always a potential for technical issues, right? So let's go back to where we were. Okay. Now, next questions. How is the project spending trending over the past 5 years in the UAE and Saudi Arabia? Well, I think I illustrated that in previous slides. It's very spiky. Oil and gas spending is very spiky year on year in each of these markets. Some years can be really good, some years can be really bad, and that's really because you have fewer projects at a higher value, and therefore you do get these peaks and troughs. But generally speaking, Saudi Arabia has been fairly steady over the last 5 years, whereas the Abu Dhabi and UAE has been fairly low since 2014-15. In fact, there's been quite a sharp fall in spending overall on average in the UAE. And I think this is why there's a lot of excitement about Hail and Gasha, because it will mark sort of some big increase in upstream oil and gas spending in Abu Dhabi in the Emirates. So we should start seeing an increase. And of course, when you add in Barouj 4 and Ta'aziz and some of these other big projects like the Fujairah LNG facility, then we can be quite optimistic about increases in spending in the UAE. Just clicking through the questions to see which ones I can answer. Okay, so we've got again another question about lower oil and gas prices and the impact on oil and gas mega projects, and the impact on some of these projects going ahead. Well, again, I think historically, if you look at NOC oil and gas spending, regardless of whether the oil price is up or whether it's down, they tend to look at the longer term horizon, the longer term picture. And indeed, many of these investments in things like petrochemicals is really, again, to diversify the economy and reduce the impact of slumps in the oil and gas price. So I think very much depending on the type of project, the rationale is very different from project to project. But also there is an understanding that demand is still growing, and with the lowest cost production costs anywhere, then the GCC is still very well placed to meet that growing demand. I mean, just look right now at the oil price. It is, where it is today because there's concerns around the supply, especially if Russia is frozen out of the global system for a lengthy amount of time. Then there is quite a big need for oil and gas extra capacity, regardless of where the oil price lies, particularly in the long term. A lot of questions here about pollution, water treatment, and so on. I think it's important to bear in mind that a lot of these projects, and of course, ultimately, there's no way to put it, or any other way to put it, that oil and gas production is not extremely environmentally friendly. However, there are attempts to try always to minimize gas flaring, to reuse output and to treat effluent coming out of the fields, but also to re-inject some of this and treat it and re-inject it back into the fields. There is also a much larger focus now on carbon capture as well, particularly in downstream industries. And as we saw with the one of the TASI's blue ammonia projects, there is going to be using hydrogen by capturing the CO2 and using that as the feedstock for the facility. So there is a greater focus on sustainability, but unfortunately, the ultimate fact is that hydrocarbons are not that environmentally friendly. But at the end of the day, the world still needs them, and demand is growing, and as a result, the Middle East still has to produce them. So they're done as environmentally friendly as possible. Of course, it's always going to be extremely challenging to make them in a green or environmentally friendly manner. Do you have a breakdown between conventional and unconventional exploration across the region? So if we look at the GCC as a whole, historically, it's almost been entirely conventional resources, very low cost and easy to produce, close to surface, good pressures, requires very little additional technology to produce. However, as oil fields age, as new, harder to obtain oil and gas resources are explored and exploited, then we're seeing increasingly more enhanced oil recovery techniques, water injection, and so on, to try and maximize output. Oman has long been a leader in that respects. We've also increasingly seeing Saudi Aramco now with its unconventional resources program. Sour gas in Abu Dhabi has been a big thing for the last 15 years, starting with the Shah sour gas program. And in Kuwait now, obviously looking at the Jurassic fields as well to try and enhance output from them too. It's still, though, dominated by conventional resources, but over time this is changing, and we will start seeing more complex EOR techniques being used, and of course with a higher cost and a higher cost of production. But at the moment, the vast majority are still conventional production programs. What do you think is the most potential for growth, LNG, ammonia, or other petrochemicals? Well, that's a difficult question to answer, and it really depends on the market. Obviously, clearly in Qatar, it's LNG. In Oman now, it's very much around green hydrogen or green ammonia production for fertilizer usage. Also, we've seen that in Egypt and Abu Dhabi too. And then petrochemicals, well, there's always going to be scope for new petrochemicals facilities, particularly those integrated with refineries and producing more niche chemicals that have not necessarily been used before or produced before in the region. So I think all three of those have very good prospects. LNG mainly in Qatar because that's got the most gas to spare, but certainly ammonia in the form of green ammonia and other petrochemicals as well. Someone's asking about the distribution of the presentation. You should receive or should be receiving the presentation in your inbox as during the course of this presentation, so you will have received it. Also, we're recording this presentation and you'll be able to view it as well in your own time in YouTube when we upload it. Why was 2022 spend on the lower end of expectations? And it's a good question. We've seen oil price this year at above $100 a barrel. However, when we are looking at spend this year, it's actually quite low compared with previous years. So why is the oil price high but spending low? And this goes back to my earlier point where oil prices do not necessarily dictate spending, but also because, well, the increase in oil prices were not necessarily expected this year. It took the post-pandemic boom, caught a lot of people by surprise. But also the fact is it takes good 18 months to 2 years for FEED contracts and conceptualization of projects. And simply put, there hasn't been enough time for the impact of these higher oil prices to filter through to new oil and gas projects. So that's one reason. The other reason is that we did see a huge increase in spending last year, and we're probably going to see a very good year in 2023. As I said, the oil and gas projects market can be very spiky. The LNG Fujairah terminal, has it been awarded? I don't believe it has. The Fujairah oil and gas, Fujairah LNG export facility, I believe, is in FEED or bidding, but we may well see it being awarded next year. Amiral, so Amiral's a live project with bidding underway. I think there are something like 5 or 6 packages under the Amiral program. Bids have been submitted and are being evaluated, and I would expect to see contract awards over the next quarter or so for that. So that will be the first big contract awards, I believe, next year. There's a question here about this table, I think, about UAE projects not appearing. Yes, so I just took selected projects by country, but of course there are many other projects in the UAE. There's the Fujairah export terminal. There's the Hail and Gasha project, of course, as well. There's the Ta'aziz petrochemical complex in Abu Dhabi and a host of other Upper Zakum, Lower Zakum development programs as well. So there's plenty of other projects in the UAE too. Someone's questioning about the BAPCO modernization program, $6 billion project in Bahrain. And yes, that's a major project for Bahrain. I haven't included it in this mega projects report or this presentation simply because it's now nearing completion, and therefore I don't think it's necessary for it wouldn't necessarily be an opportunity for many companies. Okay. Now, what about bottlenecks for EPC construction? Now, we do know, for example, in Saudi Arabia, that there is the Giga Projects program, which is draining a lot of resources and materials and labor and engineering capacity. And we know that with all this big spending planned, that there is a potential for a major crunch in oil for EPC contractors, and also a bottleneck for supply of equipment and services and materials. This is particularly the case when you take into account rising interest rates, logistical costs, and inflation as well. So there could well be a bottleneck, and we do know that NOCs like Aramco and Qatar Energy and ADNOC are working towards long lead item procurement to securing contracting capacity and ensuring that there is adequate supply of engineering, labor, equipment, and contracting going forward for their projects. But yes, there is potential for bottlenecks and very high increases in EPC prices that might delay project activity. Question here about Chinese contractors. In 2023, I believe that Chinese contractors are becoming more and more active upstream and downstream in the GCC. We are already seeing a lot more participation by them, and we do expect them to come and increase their market share, as they have done in the construction and transport sectors over the last couple of years. I would expect them also to be increasingly competitive in the oil and gas segment as well. So, as I said earlier, with the rankings of the top contractors, I do expect that this list here will change radically over the next 5 years, and we will see the likes of CNOOC, Sinopec, and other Chinese contractors, CPECC, for example, moving up this list over time. Right, running out of time, so I'll just answer a couple more questions. Now, a lot of these questions are fairly technical, and don't necessarily have the time or expertise to always to necessarily answer them now. We are making a record of your questions, and so we'll try and come back to you with the answers. Question here about other countries in the Middle East, such as Iraq and Egypt. We, of course, on MEED and MEED projects, cover those projects. The presentation today was just on GCC oil and gas mega projects. We also do cover projects in Africa. There are several interesting opportunities there, places like Uganda, but also Mozambique and Angola, as well as Nigeria. And clearly Iraq and Egypt are major centers of hydrocarbons activity too. And offshore Lebanon, well, it looks like we're progressing towards potential oil and gas concession agreements there, which would also dramatically transform the Mediterranean oil and gas sector too. Are there any collaborative approaches towards the development of mega projects across GCC states? That's a good question. We have seen in recent months, the last year, a greater collaboration, for example, on the GCC railway between GCC clients. However, not so much in terms of oil and gas spending. Obviously, we have the Dolphin pipeline between Qatar and the UAE, which is perhaps the pinnacle of oil and gas collaboration. But at the moment, we really are seeing each country working on its own. The big exception, I guess, very recently was the fact that finally Kuwait and Saudi Arabia agreed on the development of the Dora offshore gas field, which has been sort of under negotiation for 2 decades now. So that's a very positive development, and it's a good indication again of countries reaching agreement on these things. Okay, so one last question, and a question about GTL, gas to liquids. So we've got 2 big gas to liquids projects in the GCC, both in Qatar, the Pearl GTL, and another project, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, both of which were completed 10 to 15 years ago, the world's largest GTL facilities. I'm not aware of any current future plan for GTL greenfield investment. I do know that Pearl GTL is planning some brownfield works, but I don't know of any current projects or those in the pipeline for the GTL sector. Okay, so that's it for my side. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to answer all those questions. Just as I've seen that I've got a lot of questions here about the giga projects in Saudi Arabia, about construction and other markets. 2 months ago, we did do a webinar on the giga projects program in Saudi Arabia. If you go to meed.com or write to us, we will send you that webinar. You can also find it on YouTube. You can download the report that's on the giga projects program. And last month I did a webinar on the hydrogen, green hydrogen and blue hydrogen projects in the Middle East and Africa region as well. So you can look that up as well, that we've done. I will also be doing in the middle of January an outlook for 2023 across all sectors in the MENA region, looking at the prospects for the year ahead, as well as some of the major projects and challenges, opportunities and drivers for the projects market as a whole across all sectors for 2023, including some forecasts. So I hope you'll be able to join me for that. Otherwise, thank you very much for your attention today. I hope you found it valuable and insightful. I do realize I've only touched the surface of the oil and gas spending and oil and gas mega projects, you know, in the time allowed. Nonetheless, I hope it's giving you an idea of what some of these projects are that are coming up. And as I said, if you want to explore them more further, then our report goes into a much further detail on each and every project in every mega project in the oil and gas petrochemical state in the GCC. And again, if you need anything else or want to reach out to us for anything at all, please get in touch and we'd be more than happy to help where we can. So thank you very much. I wish you all a very good end of year, and I look forward to seeing you all again in mid-January for our next webinar on the 2023 outlook. Thank you again, and goodbye.